Up next, we'll be talking about one of the giants of the faith from the last century who left an incredible impression on the church and on my life as well. Stay tuned.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on another episode of The Catholic Gentleman. We are your hosts, Sam Guzman and John Heinen. Really blessed that you have decided to join us today. Hope you get a lot out of this episode. Excited to be joined by a friend of mine and expert in many things, but one that we're going to be talking about today. But before we get there, if this is your first time jumping into The Catholic Gentleman, please click that subscribe button wherever you're at. If you're on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you've listened to us multiple times, we'd love it if you gave us a review or just kick that 4 or 5 stars. That helps reach more men, moves the algorithm in the benefit of the faith, obviously, right? We want to get more Catholic listeners. We want to get more men listening and thinking deeply about their faith and growing in that. One exciting piece of business just to pass along to you, Sam and I are about to launch our Catholic Gentleman Plus, our membership program. We have spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours on it, and actually many years thinking through it, and we finally got it ready to go. And this program is going to be to help guide men both in masculinity and in holiness based on 3 pillars and categories that we need to be always working on throughout our lives as men. And we're super excited to be launching that on June 1st. So diving into the episode with the friend of mine, Roland Millare. So he is a doctor, Dr. Roland Millare. He is a native Houstonian. That's where I met him. He currently serves as the vice president of curriculum and the director of clergy initiatives for the St. John Paul II Foundation there in Houston. He served as a member of the theology department at St. John the 23rd College Preparatory School for over 15 years. And among his many degrees, he holds a licentiate or an STL. You need one of those to teach at seminary. He also owns a doctorate in sacred theology and dogmatic theology. And he serves as the adjunct professor of, hold with me, theology for permanent deacon candidates, seminarians, undergraduate and graduates at the University of St. Thomas, St. Mary's Seminary, the Diocese of Fort Worth, and the University of Dallas. He has written tons of articles, and he's published one incredible book, A Living Sacrifice, Liturgy and Eschatology in Joseph Ratzinger. And he's living in Texas. He enjoys the gift of life and love with his beautiful wife, who I've met multiple times, Veronica, and their 3 awesome children. So Roland, just again, thanks so much for joining us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on, John and Sam.
Yeah. So the big thing we want to talk about is our now deceased, may he rest in peace, Holy Father Pope Benedict XVI, and the legacy that he leaves us, the influence he has for the lives of men, and what we can always keep on learning from him. So I wanted to start and just kind of ask you what helped you fall in love with Pope Benedict, with Joseph Ratzinger and his theology. Where did that begin for you, and why did you decide to pursue it in such a degree of excellence?
Sure. So when I was an undergraduate at Franciscan University, everyone was required to take Introduction to Catholicism. And I don't know if it was just a weed out text to discourage students from majoring in theology, but everyone had to read Introduction to Christianity, which is quite a dense, maybe there you have it, a dense introduction. And so really it was my first exposure, to the thought of Ratzinger when I was a junior and senior at St. Thomas High School. I read quite a bit of John Paul, even worked through Augustine's Confessions because I had a great theology teacher. But it was in college when I first cut my teeth in Benedict. But I'd say and so I appreciated Introduction to Christianity, but it wasn't until I read Spirit of the Liturgy that I really fell in love with his thought. And now, of course, I've come to appreciate, both of those works and just really all of his works in general. I mean, I don't think in our lifetime we'll encounter the breadth and depth of that kind of intellect combined with great sanctity and humility. That's the rare thing, right? That you have someone that has, this intellectual giant, and then at the same time, a humble saint who, according to one of his students, Father Vincent Toomey, never took himself seriously, which I think is the appeal. It comes out, right? He doesn't come off, at least for me, he's never come off as a stuffy academic, in the ivory tower, writing to and for other academics, although he certainly could do that, but really was trying to speak to the world and direct everyone to the knowledge and love of Christ, the Logos.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I appreciate you sharing that, because the Spirit of the Liturgy was actually the first of his that I read, and actually what led me to fall in love with the Latin Mass and to, appreciate reverence in the liturgy and grow into that. So, how fun that you were able to read that early on. And I agree that it's just so accessible. So.
Yeah, because growing up in the 90s, right? I mean, I was part of that life teen generation. It was just emerging, quite popular. We're at the parish I grew up at. They were doing the thing where you were, surrounding the altar and a lot of praise and worship music. But the Spirit of the Liturgy really kind of reoriented, pun intended, on the liturgy in more than one sense. I mean, and so I began to, look for this kind of reform the reform, or this liturgy celebrated with, a spirit of reverence that I hadn't yet encountered.
Yeah, I love that as well about Pope Benedict. Just such a unique figure in that he had the rare ability to bring together just the simple piety of just an everyday Christian, with, again, yes, this towering intellect, but also this deep reverence and love for our Lord that shone through everything that he did. Some of my favorite pictures of him are him in adoration. Like, there's just this look on his face that's just so captivating. He's the way he gazes at Christ in the Eucharist. And but I remember my first encounter with him was at a Catholic bookstore in Colorado Springs, and I wasn't Catholic yet. But I was just curious, and I was exploring in there, and there's a little book called The Joy of Knowing Christ. And it was little excerpts from his various sermons throughout the year. And just a beautiful little book that was like, this man, I don't know about this whole Catholic thing, but I know that this man loves Jesus Christ. Like, that was the impression that was left with me. And it wasn't the kind of book that blows you away with how intelligent he was, but just his love for Christ just shone through that book and made a huge impression on me. And so I'm just wondering, what are there's so much that he wrote, and just seems like every day I'm discovering a new Ratzinger book about some topic that you never thought of. But what are some of the themes that captured you as a young man discovering him and starting to be impressed by how intelligent he was? But what are some of the themes that really marked his corpus, and the ones that really jumped out at you as you were on your own intellectual journey?
Sure. I mean, I think the first one you've already, touched upon, that kind of the Christocentrism, that centrality of Jesus Christ. In Deus Caritas Es, his first encyclical, right? He says Christianity, its centrality, it's not an idea or an abstraction. It's a person. It's Christ. I think it was World Youth Day in Munich. He said, the happiness that you seek has a face and a name, Jesus in the Holy Eucharist. And it's such a simple thought, but yet a very profound one. It was, in many ways, the shift of Vatican II to kind of refocus and reemphasize the centrality of Christ. I mean, as quoted often, by John Paul and Benedict and countless others, Gaudium et Spes 22, right? Christ fully reveals man to himself, right? If I really want to understand myself as a man or just as a human person in general, I need to first encounter and know and love Christ. So I would say that, is one of the central themes that sticks out for me. A second theme would be this. It seems obscure, but it comes up in the more recent intro or forward in Introduction to Christianity. and elsewhere, right? This notion of the primacy of the logos, right? So here, a little heavy lifting. The $50 Greek word logos just means word, reason, or meaning, and it's primacy over ethos, right? I mean, so think ethic or will. So we have this adage in theology: action follows being. I mean, so what I do, how I act, ethics, follows from my understanding of who I am, anthropology or being. And first and foremost, for Benedict, he gets this from the German theologian Romano Guardini, is this notion of the primacy of logos. When we don't keep that first and foremost, when we will end up subordinating everything to the will, right? In other words, simply because I can do it, I should do it. And you see that sort of sentiment very dominant in our culture, right? I mean, you do you, right? I mean, there is no rational thought that goes into something. In fact, people, have surrendered any notion of rational thought. There's my truth, there's your truth, his truth, her truth, etc. Right? I mean, as he would say in his homily before his election as Pope, as then Cardinal Ratzinger, there is a dictatorship of relativism. And that ties us to another theme, right? I mean, the whole notion, connected to the primacy of logos is this relationship between faith and reason. I mean, John Paul II described these as two wings that lift us up towards the truth. And you see this again and again. In fact, one of the, I think, neglected pieces of Benedict's pontificate are really his speeches. I mean, go to his political speeches when he's in Westminster in England, or the Bundestag in Germany, or, of course, the famous Regensburg speech. I mean, again and again, it's about this harmony between faith and reason. These two things aren't opposed to one another. In fact, when we, don't let faith be guided by reason, it can result in violence. And the same is true even for reason as well, as we saw one of the bloodiest of centuries. And of course, the liturgy, is a prominent theme. I mean, from Benedict's rule, he quotes this in his book on the theology of the liturgies, the collected works, above all else, right? I mean, it's about the liturgy. The liturgy should have this priority, which should frame how we live our lives. Another major theme is, the notion, what I call, others call theology of saints, that this is really the ultimate end. It's about sanctity. I mean, it's a neglected theme, right? I mean, he'll talk about the example of St. Teresa of Lisieux, or Teresa of Calcutta, or Martin de Porres, or St. Damien of Molokai, and they really represent kind of a lived or interpreted theology. And so, those are at least some of the themes that come to mind from his legacy, and we could talk about any of those, but those are ones that I can think of. So.
Oh, I really appreciate it, because we could talk about any of those, and part of me wants to have multiple episodes to talk about each of those. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually take it back to your first one about our faith being a relationship, because I really appreciate you mentioning that. I remember listening to reading the translation of his argument with Jürgen Habermas, this great galactic, philosopher and intellect, on the dialectics of secularization. And I just remember being so overwhelmed by their conversation and their thought, and then a little frightened. I was like, I'm not going to get this, Pope. Like, this is not. But then again, reading things like Introduction to Christianity, or The Spirit of Liturgy, or some of his talks, it just kind of really opened up that relationship aspect. And I kind of wanted to bring us back to that, because I think it is something that has been, and he identified it, and actually he helped me identify it, that our faith is a relationship. It's a relationship with God. It's a relationship with Christ. And I feel like we have a tendency, especially in our American minds or modern minds, and that's kind of what I want to speak to here, living in America, where we have to compartmentalize everything. Everything has to be a black and white. Like, so for instance, if I want to do God's will, then I need to know exactly what God's will is. And if I don't do God's will, I'm going to hell, or something like that. Like, we look at these crossroads in life where maybe I have to choose a different job, right? Or maybe it's a discernment about which parish to go to, or a discernment of where to live and which house to purchase, really any of those things. And we want to bring God into it because of our relationship and our love with him. But very often we have this idea that God's will is only down one of those roads, right? Or God himself is only present down one of those roads. And if we choose the wrong one, we're leaving God behind, or we're somehow making a moral decision of these issues in life. And so I'd love for you to talk more about that relational aspect of that Benedict brought to the forefront, because my wife and I very frequently stated that we just want to be coffee pals with Pope Benedict if we make it to heaven. Is just to sit and just bask in that. So.
Yeah, it's funny. What comes to mind is there was one of his doctoral students who spent, I think it was he had reached 10 years of just writing, researching, reading, refining, and his director, right, then Father Ratzinger, said, "Hey, how's it going?" And he said, "Well, I'm, still doing this in terms of research, reading." And, Ratzinger is known to being a very good listener. And he listened, and then he just made the simple response was, well, you have to allow it to be imperfect, right? In other words, like, you're never going to write this, perfect work in one sitting. But I mean, to your point, right? I mean, people make, discernment a vocation, right? They say they're discerning every little thing, right? As opposed to just you make decisions, you execute them. And then really the discernment sometimes takes place after the fact. With respect to relationality, yes, he's emphasized, quite a bit that, God is this relation of persons. And you can see it reflected in how much he valued relationships and friendships. Continuing to meet with his former students, year after year after year. Continual correspondences he would carry on with both strangers and friends, some of which were, people he'd known when he was a young priest. And so relationships, friendships, people mattered. And to our American culture, right, especially among men, right, we're not good at, cultivating friendships, especially friendships about the things that matter. I think he's a good model for us, right? In terms of the need for us to foster those friendships. We will only thrive in community, and we need friendships that will discuss the permanent things, the things that matter. Because that's what he did with his former students who now become his friends, right? We're going to have the symposium talking about Islam or evolution or the liturgy, right? Whatever it might be. Not that it's wrong in itself to talk about sports, to talk about, the things of this world, but we also need to, if we want friendships that matter, we want to talk about those permanent things.
Amen.
Yeah, those are really important insights. And, one of the relationships, not interpersonally, but perhaps in a inter-Christian or ecumenical sense that I'd like to get your thoughts on too. Before my final stage of my conversion to Catholicism, like one of the moments that made a huge impression on me was Pope Benedict in Westminster Abbey, which you've already alluded to. And I considered myself, an Anglican at that point. Like, I thought, well, it's got all the ingredients, of like liturgy and like some historical sense, and Anglicans can be very Catholic and can be basically 100% Catholic without the Pope, like 99% Catholic, without the Pope in some cases, not all of them. But and I was very content in that milieu, and just didn't think I needed anything else, and was maybe considering even becoming an Anglican priest. And then Pope Benedict went to England and was sitting next to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and I just distinctly remember thinking, which man is the Holy Father that I'm looking for? The spiritual leader, the spiritual father, the center, the unity, the point of unity. And there was just no question in my mind, just this intuitive response that Pope Benedict was the one. There was just something so powerful about his presence, even though he's a very humble man, not very physically imposing or anything. There's just something about his presence there. And so I'd like to hear you talk about a little bit about his outreach, perhaps to Anglicans in particular, but also to Christians of all faiths that have created a tremendous amount of converts. Like, what was his secret? Like, how did he brought so many people into the church, and like, whole parishes in some cases into the church, like Anglican parishes and things. So like, what was he trying to do there, and what was so effective about his approach?
As far as effective his approach, he reminds us that dialogue etymologically and in reality is about dialogos, or that is two parties that are supposed to be searching for the truth. And you see in his writings, right, he engages not just, Catholic thinkers, right? He's engaging, Jewish thinkers, Protestant thinkers, all kinds of varying scholars, and enters into authentic dialogue with them, articulating the truths that they're able to come to, maybe pointing out, shortcomings. And then really, as far as his legacy, I think Anglicanorum Cedibus is one of the overlooked pieces of his legacy, right? This document, his generosity in allowing, former Anglicans, Episcopalians, to enter into full communion with the Catholic Church. There's these entire communities, and keep their Anglican patrimony, which has always been kind of a part of his ecclesiology, recognizing that there is unity within the church, but within that unity there is room for a certain legitimate diversity. And so he really, the success is that he reminds us what ecumenism is also about, right? It is ordered towards unity, right? It's not just interminable discussion or dialogue, right? At some point, right, you wanted to move together, towards the truth. And I think we've seen that. Only time will tell. But I think we will. It's one of the lasting legacies of Benedict as Pope, right? Ancillor Cedibus, and this path of communion, generous path of communion for those former Anglicans and Episcopalians, and really, thinkers of all. I've seen a book like Protestant Thinkers and Joseph Ratzinger, right? Or there was a scripture conference at Baylor where they highlighted different scripture scholars, and one year they highlighted the thought of Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI. I think it shows that he, was recognized and valued simply because of his approach to the truth, and it was uncompromising in it, but at the same time charitable in his discussion with others, right? I think that's the key, right? I think the Venerable Fulton Sheen says, right, when an argument loses soul, you can sure say the truth, but do it in such a way that it turns people off, shuts off conversation, turns people away. So the other element of or ingredient for his success is that he articulated the truth in a charitable way. Hence his third encyclical, right? Caritas in Veritate, right? There's this need for this relationship between charity and truth, right? In order to fully appreciate charity, it needs to be guided by truth, lest it fall into sentimentality. At the same time, when we communicate truth, it should be done charitably if we wanted to take root in others.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things in an issue that you talked about earlier was his kind of approach to modern relativism and what we all experience today. And I am mindful, because you brought it up with Introduction to Christianity, where very frequently we try and get in conversations with people in the secular faith, and we are like that clown, as he mentioned at the beginning of Introduction to Christianity. And that story, real quick for our listeners, is that the clown is the theologian who is part of a circus, and the circus starts going on fire, and the manager sends the clown to the neighboring town to get help, and the clown goes in to ask for help, and they all think he's hilarious, and that, they're all applauding him and thinks he's just, giving on a show, but really he's looking for help. And we at times who are trying to bring people to the faith and trying to bring people to our faith, they've kind of already chalked it up. Oh, you're Catholic. That's not for me. And I'd love for your thoughts on just what Benedict taught you, or what Benedict can teach us in approaching kind of the modern agnostic world, right? Relativistic world, universalist world, whatever you call it, to approach it purposefully and with intent, because we as men, we have to have that, right? We have to give account for our hope and for our reason, and we have to approach these things. And I know you've spoken of, and between, you know, monastic theology and what is it, the scholastic theology and things like that. But nevertheless, not putting your thoughts in your mind, I want to hear from you what you think Benedict can teach us to kind of approach the modern world. And what are some things that us men could be doing to prepare ourselves to meet these individuals where they're at?
Yeah, so, I mean, Introduction to Christianity, I mean, what came to mind was the other story in there, right? I mean, that atheist that goes to all the Jewish rabbis. I forget if the story comes from Martin Buber or where it originates from, but, you know, he expounds on, you know, his reasons for not believing God, and all the rabbis give all these traditional arguments. None of them are convincing. Then finally, you know, he's exhorted or advised to go seek this other rabbi at the edge of town, the wisest and holiest, and he listened carefully, right, to the atheist's arguments, and, you know, kind of paced back and forth, and he didn't give an argument. I mean, instead he said, but perhaps it's true, or something of that effect, right? Perhaps it's true. I mean, so that's one strategy, right? We have to be willing to propose that the Christian worldview is, you know, has, you know, a seat at the table, just as any other worldview does. And then in the book, Christianity, the Crisis of Cultures, he draws upon Pascal, and then he, drawing upon Pascal's wager, you know, he proposes that even non-believers should at the very least, if they can't, you know, accept or articulate there is a God, to at least live as if there were a God, right? I mean, and you know, and so that's an interesting proposal, right? I mean, to those universalists, to those, you know, non-Christians, I mean, to at least live as practical Christians. And of course, for Pascal, right, if you do this long enough, if you live this way, eventually it will, you know, you'll begin to believe that way as well. But that's part of the problem, right? We have Christians who are practical atheists, right? I mean, they might check off the box. They might even go to church on Sunday, but practically how they live their lives, they might as well, you know, they're living as if God did not exist. Whereas you find some atheists who are practical Christians. You know, but I think, you know, those are the things that come to mind, right? I mean, perhaps it's true, or proposing to, you know, non-believers. You know, and for men, that means, you know, at some point in our conversation with coworkers, with friends, with family members, at some point we have to be intentional. We don't necessarily force the conversation, but we propose. I think it was the Swiss theologian Honoris von Balthasar who sent Ratzinger a postcard with the words that said simply, do not presuppose the faith, but propose it, right? And I think that's what we need to be more intentional in doing, in proposing the faith, or proposing its possibility.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I love most about Benedict that often gets forgotten and is in his evangelization efforts was the power of beauty to, in some sense, bypass the intellect. Not that it's not there's not intellectual truth there, but like the it's like our culture is like given up on the idea of truth at some level, and he's like, and there's this importance of this way of beauty or via pulchritudinous that he talks about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what Benedict articulated there, and like what is the importance for us as men, but also for the culture at large as we're seeking to evangelize.
Sure. I mean, in his interview on the Ratzinger report with Victoria Missori, he has that line where the greatest argument or the greatest apologia for Christianity boils down to two things: the saints and then the art which the church has produced. So in other words, I mean, goodness, I mean, sanctity, holiness, and then to your point, the via pulchritudinus, the way of beauty, right? Beauty. And so, I think at the end of the day, right, I mean, different people are going to receive the faith in different ways. I mean, for some, it is going to be that intellectual conversion. So truth is what's going to be most important. But probably for most people, you lead with either goodness or beauty, all of which is to, direct us ultimately back to Christ. As men, it does require a certain familiarity with, maybe some basics of, what is beauty, understanding some sacred artwork, sacred music, really being cultured, culture or being cultured. At some point was seen some kind of snobby thing or, something for people with lots of money. But the reality is, we have this patrimony of beauty, which certainly John, and I'm sure Sam, you can speak to, right, in terms of music that we've neglected. And if we want to overcome that, I think we could all stand to be immersed in it, because sometimes that's what draws people in. If you think about it, even in Western Europe, people will still go to see these churches. People will still go to these, requiem masses from Mozart. There's still something about these, about beauty that attracts and draws people in. But we have to take the next step and explain to them, well, why they're ultimately attracted to this beauty, but we can if we ourselves don't know it and aren't immersed in it.
Pursuing it, yeah. No, I completely agree. We do call all men to start learning to appreciate beauty, both in visual. We had Robert Pushouts, an artist, on our show. We've had a couple of musicians on our show, and that's and not just producing the music, but actually understanding the music. And I feel like we couldn't have a conversation without talking a little bit more about the liturgy, and your conversations about beauty just really entered into that, because Benedict was really big on beauty, and in his Spirit of the Liturgy, he brought that out. And I know that you and I have both been able to experience the cathedral there of Our Lady of Walsingham, of the Ordinariate, and the music that they bring, the stained glass, the whole architecture and everything is just so beautiful that it just supports and helps the liturgy in ways that, somebody couldn't quite list them all. And so I'd love for you to talk about the liturgy, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what Benedict saw as the core principles and components of the liturgy that must be there and must remain, because you've been able to experience them all, I know, in Houston, as well as here at Dallas-Fort Worth. We're so incredibly blessed to have multiple TLMs, traditional Latin Mass. We've got, there's 3 ordinariate parishes up here in Dallas-Fort Worth, and I know there's at least 2 down in Houston, and then some Novus Ordo parishes that are doing their best to practice good liturgy. And so I'd love for you to talk about some of the core components of Benedict XVI's theology on the liturgy.
Sure. There's a lot we could. That's a whole
episode itself. That's a book. Right? Yeah, exactly.
But where to even begin? But the liturgy is above all the Opus Dei, right? It's the work of God. It's not our work. Yes. It requires our, or rather, we're called to actively and actually participate in the sacred liturgy. But first and foremost, it's God's work. In fact, in the Spirit of Liturgy, he highlights as kind of the contrast, the golden calf, right? There in the Exodus, the Israelites engage in false worship. They want to construct and make worship into their own image, as opposed to following the careful, guidelines and laws that God has outlined. And the same problem happens in liturgy now, right? When people begin to take the liturgy as something that they can manipulate to their own ends, right? You come up with all kinds of bizarre things, whether it's the priest who's celebrating Mass out on the raft in the ocean, or the priest coming down the aisle on his hoverboard, right? There's countless bad examples that we can think of. Yes. Truly, liturgy has ceased to be the Opus Dei, right? So that's one theme, right? The liturgy is is God's act first and foremost. The other thing is, understanding, using the book of Exodus to understand the sacred liturgy. Oftentimes we think of the book of Exodus as this movement of from slavery to freedom, which it is, right, in terms of promising. But that freedom is for a further end. That further end is to worship God in our own in the way in which God wants us to worship Him. And so Ratzinger does this beautiful job of outlining this relationship between liturgy, life, and ethics, right? Because there on Mount Sinai, we get not just the Ten Commandments, how we're called to live morally, but also how we're called to worship. So these things work together. In fact, the very word Exodus, you see, the only time I think it's used in the New Testament is relationship to the Transfiguration, right? When Christ appears there, with Moses on the one side, Elijah on the other, and he tells Peter, James, and John that he was speaking of his exodus, right? His exodus, and we as Christians are called to an exodus as well, that we can't accomplish apart from living the moral life and then worshiping as we ought. And then what a lot of people focus in on the spirit of liturgy is the whole notion of ad orientem, right? This tradition of worshiping facing towards the east, which has always been our tradition. And he does a very good job of outlining like that we need to recover this. And if not, if it's impractical, right? And so this shows his wisdom as pastor. He says, all right, at the very least, right, you put a crucifix on the altar as kind of a, liturgical east, kind of the, a symbolic oriens, but wherever possible, right? Why not, turn the priest back around? And sometimes people have this misunderstanding that the priest is turning his back on the faithful. It's not that he's turning his back on the faithful. He is outwardly symbolizing what we all need to be doing in liturgy, and that is orienting ourselves towards the Lord. And on the one hand, right, this is a cosmic and eschatological symbol. We're all standing ready, waiting in anticipation of the Lord who comes again. But also it's the word conversion itself means to turn around. So it's also a symbol of how we ought to live our lives, that is oriented back towards the Lord. And then given all that he says about the liturgy, beauty matters at the end of the day, because beauty helps us to show and to help the faithful to understand what's really unfolding in terms of the wedding feast of the Lamb. Unfortunately, the phrase used in Vatican II, noble simplicity, has come to mean that you strip the liturgy and churches, right, of its beauty, when the opposite is the case. In fact, in Sacramentum Caritatis, he talks about beauty being the veritatis splendor, right, the splendor of truth, right? If the liturgy really is, the heavenly banquet, then we should do all that we can to help highlight that. That's always been our tradition. And in a culture that's increasingly illiterate, why not lean into the visual and the things that can be heard, right? Because that traditionally has taught people and rooted them in the truth. Once again, the notion of beauty. So chant, for example, bringing back chant, which should be normative for our worship. Bringing back churches that look like churches and not just warehouses.
Imagine.
Putting back iconography, beautiful statues that help draw us back into the worship, right? We can learn from our brethren in the East, right? And their beautiful iconostasis, right? There they have kind of canonized which icons go where and varying symbols and and so forth, right? But we've lost that. In the West, we kind of have this iconoclasm that has come to reign when we need to restore beauty in the sacred.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's obviously change is slow, but I have seen the fruit of those liturgical efforts, those liturgical restorations. In fact, at the risk of being a little controversial here, I remember when I was a brand new convert. It was about 2011, and when we came into the church, the translation of the missal was frankly abysmal. Like, it was like kindergarten language, like just like so atrocious. And then he issued like 6 months after we converted, like the new translation of the Mass came out, and the New English translation, and it was worlds different, like just so much more dignified and everything. And so just little things like that, like commissioning a New English translation or things like that, that restore the dignity of the liturgy, just made a huge effort, or I mean, a huge impact on the church, I should say. So, just kind of last.
Yeah, no. In fact, I remember after. I remember after my, as the new translation came in, my father passed, and so it was being implemented in Advent or whatever. It was, so for my father's funeral mass, we asked my pastor if he'd celebrate the funeral mass honorantum, and then it was that coupled with using, the new translation, and then, my parish in St. Teresa Sugar Land, we have beautiful sacred music, and all of those things together, it had an impact on people. I remember, people, some of them hadn't darkened the church, a Catholic church liturgy in years, or some had never experienced a Catholic liturgy, but many of them commented just how beautiful it was. In fact, one man said, if the liturgy had only stayed this way, I would have never have left.
Wow.
And this wasn't a TLM. This wasn't, this was the new missal, just celebrated reverently, with an updated translation in all of its beauty, using the church's patrimony of chant and other good hymnody, and that simple thing can make all the difference. So
yeah, exactly. Amen. Yeah. Yeah, just kind of last question for me is just about Pope Benedict's legacy, and so many contributions in so many different areas of the church. But as you look to the future of the Catholic Church, like, what do you feel like is really going to stick? Like, what is really going to continue to grow and flourish? Maybe everything, I don't know, but like, just like what themes like that we've discussed, or maybe other ones that that Pope Benedict kind of inaugurated or really emphasized, like, will bear the most fruit in the future as you see it?
Yeah, so I think that we'll continue to see the fruits of the Anglican of Anglinorum Cedibus. I hope there'll be more of that kind of ecumenical spirit, or real fruitful ecumenism that will follow something like Anglinorum Cedibus as a model, right? I mean, maybe there's rooms for other communities. I mean, let's say the Lutherans somehow, right? And there'd have to be some major changes or acceptances in terms of theology, right? Especially thinking in the areas of grace and faith and works, etc. But I mean, maybe there are. I'm hoping those fruits will last. I mean, I think his wisdom on the liturgy, I think, will continue to abide. I mean, I know there are people who, will point to things like Summorum Pontificum, and it's been displaced by the present motu proprio. But nevertheless, I mean, I think different motu propria will come and go. But I mean, as far as his wisdom of how to understand the liturgy and to appreciate it, I mean, I think the spirit of the liturgy, when we look back on the history of the church, will be seen as a key moment, in which we really begin to understand and appreciate the liturgy anew in the same way. I mean, in other words, inauguration of what he hoped for, a new liturgical movement. The other fruit, I mean, I hope it will be kind of a renewal of theology, in terms of, theology being built upon that foundation, the relationship between faith and reason. It's ordered towards, the call to sanctity, and that need for the centrality of Christ. And I'm hoping more people, just the average everyday person, will read more of Ratzinger. My hope is that they'll translate more of his homilies, because I think that's where the the neglect is. I think Cardinal DiNardo here in Houston says that Benedict was the greatest homilist since Augustine, which is a strong statement. But for I think people to appreciate that will need to translate more of his homilies. In fact, in his collected works, the volumes on homilies, I think there's like 3 giant German tomes, so it's like thousands of pages, and so I hope that will come to reign. And the maybe the other legacy is just really how he lived his life, right? That approach to truth with humility, with firmness, and that ability to listen to others. I mean, they said, for example, when he was the head of the CDF, the Congregation of Doctrine and Faith, I guess now it's the DDF, the Dicastery, he would let everyone speak. He would start with the youngest members of the CDF first, those who are newest to the congregation, and then he'd hear from everybody, and then he would kind of synthesize everything he'd heard and then give his opinion. But he allowed others to speak first, right? I mean, that's real kind of servant leadership at work, right? I mean, that ability to listen actively and thoughtfully. And kind of the elephant in the room, right? I think people will continue to wrestle and struggle with, what they see as his abdication, right? His resigning in 2013, right? I mean, I know one person, for example, he compares it to being abandoned by his father. There is, for varying reasons, hurt there, for a number of reasons that, we don't have time to go into. But, I mean, we could say this, right? At some point, Benedict makes the comment that it's not like a father abandoning his family. At some point, the father recognizes he's reached a certain stage in life where he doesn't have the strength and the vitality he once had. And so he must allow one of his sons then to pick up where he left off. And that's where I think the legacy continues, right? For those of us to pick up where he left off.
So I appreciate all that. I think that's it's spot on. So where would you suggest men get started reading Benedict or understanding Benedict or listening to him with, there's just so many books. And as you and I both know, some of them are dense and some of them are not. And then you were mentioning homilies. Would you suggest that? And if so, where would you go? I'd love to hear your final thoughts just on what we men can do to better appreciate and understand Benedict. And then obviously to live, not just him, but his teachings and what he stood for, to become better men for the world today.
So I think if you want, just kind of a big picture, I think any of the interviews that he has done with Peter Seewald would be a good place to start. If you want to dive straight into his thought, I recommend Jesus of Nazareth. As far as papal writings, my favorite, I know most people probably say Deus Caritas Est, but I think Spe Salvi. I think his encyclical on hope. If you kind of look at the fractured, hurt, divided culture, we could use some hope, and really it is kind of a response to the modern world. I think especially people have put quite a bit of hope, as it were, right, into politics, and I think there he does a very good job of kind of reorienting us, right. In fact, he goes so far as to say, right, one of the chief tasks of Christianity is to sever politics from eschatology, right. Politics is about ethics. And then he writes about prayer and suffering and gives, this beautiful account of Saint Josephine Bakhita and the example of Cardinal Win Van Tuan and others. So I'd start there. Or there's a number of his, short works. Behold the Pierce one, or Call to Communion, or Spirit of the Liturgy. And then, of course, you can't go wrong with his homily. So, but I go on. But those would be my thoughts. But the thing would be to intentionally, pick things up. I know I've tried. Since Benedict has passed, to just kind of reread certain things, or maybe read some essays that or homilies I haven't read yet. But to kind of lean into his thought intentionally. I was actually at Eighth Day Books several months ago. It's a small, these last great bookstores in Wichita, Kansas. And they told me they had sold out of Ratzinger books. As soon after he died, just people made a run on Ratzinger books, right? And it's a great little store, right? Put a little plug, Eighth Day Books, right? I mean, be forewarned. I mean, you forget what it's like to pay retail, but I mean, it is good to support the brick and mortar. But yeah, they are out. They were out. There was a big run on Ratzinger books. So I'm hoping more and more people will read and come to appreciate him. I think it was in the Pillar. There was interviews they did of just people in line to pay the respects to Benedict as he was laying in state. And then there was one priest who said, "I just came to see Father Ratzinger." And I think that kind of says it all. I mean, that he was this really a humble servant in God's vineyard.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight one of the things that you mentioned about Pope Benedict being a synthesizer and a harmonizer, able to unite these various viewpoints. I feel like he didn't choose his name by accident, because Saint Benedict, his motto was Pax, or peace. And I think that's what Pope Benedict represents to me, is just a man of peace in a time of disintegration and things falling apart, a lot of tensions within the church. Pope Benedict always seemed to find a way to bring people together, to reestablish them in the bark of Peter, and to bring harmony and peace back to the church in just such a beautiful, faithful way. So that's one of the things I love most about him. But in conclusion, could you just maybe share with us how we can get your books or book or anything else that you've written?
Sure. My book, A Living Sacrifice, Liturgy and Eschatology, Joseph Ratzinger, is, of course, available via Amazon or via the publisher Emmaus Academic, which is printed by St. Paul Biblical Center, Emmaus Road, right? I mean, all these publishing houses, all these multiple names. And so there you have it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Roland. We're really blessed to have you join us to talk about such a legacy and such an amazing man, and that we were all blessed to live through his pontificate. And so we just really appreciate your time and being with us.
No, thank you, gentlemen. I enjoyed it. I didn't mean, it's interesting, right? I lived, as you all did, right through John Paul's death and funeral, and it was obviously moving and for various ways. But this death hit me harder for some, for whatever reason. You felt the kind of the paternal, or almost like loss of a grandfather.
Yeah, agreed. Well, let's all keep the Holy Father in our prayers, Benedict XVI. Of course, keep Francis in your prayers as well, but keep the repose of the soul of Benedict in your prayers. So as we like to end each of our episodes,
be a man, be a saint.